All right, I want to cover the gonads. When we left off on Reproduction, and what I had said was the main thing you got to know is that they secrete the sex hormones. I don't really want to say much else about them because really most of the sex hormones come from the gonads, not the adrenal cortex. I do know zona reticularis, they do secrete some sex hormones. I'm not going to do these on your half sheet, usually I would, but try to practice the RAS mechanism. And then when you think you kind of got it, come back and use these as a review to test your knowledge. Just make a note of that slide. And let's move on to the gonads. Now, these are mainly taught in Chapter 28, Repro, that's the next unit, but I'll just kind of mention their hormonal function here, and then it'll help us get ready for the histology slides. We're going to look at ovary under the microscope and testes under the microscope. And I want you to know what you're looking at when we see that. So we'll do the female gonad first. The gonads are in the pelvis in the female. Ovary. I'll say lateral wall of pelvis. Can't really tell from that picture where they are in the pelvis. We'll learn about the whole reproductive system in the next unit. But if you cut just the gonad and kind of look at it, this illustration typically represents the menstrual cycle, 28 days. So when you see it like this, it's for illustrative purposes only. I mean, you don't see all of these structures at once. In a 28-day cycle, the first 14 days starts at the smaller follicles with the oocytes, and they become larger and larger. And as you develop follicles, one is chosen for ovulation. This one, this big one. We use the term follicle like we did for thyroid, but not to be confused with the thyroid. This is the ovary. Here, the follicle contains the oocyte. The lay term is egg, right? Oocyte is the correct word. That is the single cell that has undergone meiosis that when you ovulate it can be fertilized by sperm. Okay. So once again, first couple of weeks of a normal cycle gets up to ovulation. Ovulation typically taught at day 14. The second couple of weeks is this part here, these yellow structures and this white structure. We'll talk about the follicle development leading up to ovulation for endocrine. Now I'll teach you the whole thing when we get to repro. It's important to at least understand half of it now so you can understand the structures that secrete estrogen. Okay. And so the pictures we used to teach, pictures I take are something like this. So to make sense of this, let me give you some background on the ovary. Okay, so for reproduction, germline cells, basically we say sperm and egg, right? People knows what those are. If I just said eggs, we call them oocytes. And let's back up all the way to when a female hasn't even been born yet. Okay? Call it during gestation or pregnancy. The oocytes are called, the germline cells, a more immature kind, are called the oogonium. Those are the germline cells in females. So gestation for females. The oogonium undergo mitosis. Not meiosis, just regular cell division. You're trying to get as many as you can. So one cell becomes 2 cells, becomes 4 cells. Right? You just try to amplify as many of these quote-unquote eggs as you can. Now, it turns out at around the 7th month of pregnancy, of gestation, 7 months, you get follicle formation. A wall of cells will form around these unprotected little oocytes. So here's an oocyte with a nucleus. And you build a wall of cells around it. Each of these squamous cells surround the oocyte inside. And so I said squamous cell. They form a wall around it. You call the whole thing a follicle, a very immature follicle called a primordial follicle. And remember, a follicle contains something. It contains the oocyte inside there. That's the name of this cell, oocyte. One of my favorite words in physiology. It's got the two O's, so you get to say oocyte. But that's the egg. That's got the genetic material that can be passed on to the next generation. And you might have something like of these primordial follicles, 1 to 2 million. And this is before the female is even born. It's only 7 months gestation. I mean, it's typically 9 months, right? So let's go to birth. Now that you have the follicles formed. So now you're at birth. Of course, a little newborn baby girl is not sexually mature yet, right? But you do have something like 1 to 2 million primordial follicles. No more mitosis, okay? It's done because you've arrested mitosis by putting a wall of cells around the egg. And it can't do mitosis anymore because it's got a wall around it, okay? So however many of these that you have at birth is how many you'll have throughout your reproductive life. And sexual maturity doesn't occur until puberty, around age 12 and a half, right? So let's skip to puberty. Maybe you're down to something like 400,000. There's some attrition here of the primordial follicles. They're not mature yet. They can't make the estrogen, okay? The follicle cells that surround it are small squamous cells, and they can't do anything. So anyways, on this slide, look at the edge. That's where the primordial follicles are. All these small structures are primordial follicles. Look at the size. But look how big they can become. Notice how the more mature follicles are more in the center. That's where the blood is, where the hormone is that can develop it. And let's remember the name of the hormone that is responsible for follicular development, FSH. Follicle, F, stimulating hormone. It'll stimulate, well, not all 400,000. There's enough hormone to stimulate a cohort of about 20 for a given cycle. With the first one being at, your first one at puberty. And then on until menopause. So about 12 and a half years to like 50.5, which is the average age of menopause. Menopause is the term used when the ovaries are depleted of eggs. There's eggs no more, okay? So you ovulate about 1 per month. And if you do the math, it's not gonna add up to 400,000. So along the way, you're losing follicles, okay? But that's the reproductive age, puberty to menopause. And so what happens is FSH, it'll target something like 20 primordial follicles. And it'll start to develop them. They'll get a little bigger, okay? And maybe they'll become what are called the primary follicles. still immature, but it's advanced from primordial. So you got the oocyte. Maybe it's surrounded by cuboidal cells instead of squamous cells. So the cells are getting bigger. The follicle cells are the ones that are going to be producing the sex hormone. So that's a good example of what a primary may look like. They're still really small. Let me see if I can find one on the slide. That one's a good example, number 2, primary. So it's a little bit bigger than those guys out there in the edge. All of these in the edge, primordials, primary right there. And so then it'll get to what's called a secondary follicle stage. These 20, okay? Now you're not going to ovulate 20. How many ovulate? One is chosen, the one. That is the next, if it's fertilized and doing full term, your son or daughter. All right. But you want enough, say 20, to reach secondary follicle stage. Because then you're starting to get the follicle structures that can produce estrogens. Okay? And I don't want to try to draw it. Let me point it out to you. Like here's number 3 is a good secondary. Number 3, secondary. And there's another 3. 3 means they're all secondary. Primary, primordial, primary, secondary. See how you have the oocyte inside? You can even see some of the genetic material right there, or right there. So that's the quote-unquote egg. But all of these cells are follicle cells that are responsible for producing estrogen. So all of the cells that surround it in this outer layer here, they're called granulosa cells. That's what you call them. So let me see if I can draw that out. So maybe you have an oocyte, and it's got some follicle cells around it. I'll just draw them as individual lines. And then maybe there's a gap, a fluid-filled gap. Then you got more cells around that. Let me draw a few layers. The layers of cells that I'm just trying to draw as individual red lines are called granulosa cells. They're not the cells that surround the oocyte. They're called something else. Corona radiata, we'll get to that. But these ones have the endocrine function. And there's also these connective tissue cells that have an endocrine function that surround the granulosa cells. I'll use a different color. And those ones that I illustrated green, the cells around the follicle are called Pika. The full term is Pika folliculi. I just use Pika for short. Well, anyways, the prize in the middle is the most important thing. The oocyte. It's got the genetic material. Oocyte. Call the whole thing, in your notes, secondary follicle. And number 3 on the slide are examples of what they look like under the microscope. So it's the theca and the granulosa cells that have the endocrine function. Theca secretes androstenedione. Now this is female, it's ovary. Do you remember if this was male or female? This hormone. It's male, but it's converted to the female hormone by which enzyme? Aromatase. Aromatase. We noted that earlier before the break. What happens is this is transferred to the granulosa cells. And under under the influence of FSH in the granulosa cells, I'll say under FSH influence, androstenedione is converted to estrone by aromatase. I'll write it again. Androstenedione aromatase converted to estrone, an estrogen. And that is what is secreted into the bloodstream for further female sex development. Okay. So, make the connection. FSH is helping the aromatase operate in these granulosa cells. And I think that is the details of why these follicles, when you get to secondary, it's more mature. You don't see it until you get to a sexually mature female. Okay. And again, you're developing, in each cycle, you're developing something like 20 of them. Okay, that's enough to get enough estrogen in the body for changes. Well, anyways, I know my drawings are very crude, but can you tell the difference between secondary and Graphean? If this is secondary, and I say identify this big one, that's the it's called tertiary or Graphean. It's the mature follicle. And in humans, per cycle, you have one that reaches this development. See how this big fluid-filled space is kind of shaped like a moon? They call it the antrum. Here is just kind of like little puddles. It's kind of like I drew here, a little fluid-filled space. So let me talk about tertiary after secondary. So tertiary follicle, I typically call it Graphene, 2 A's. It's the largest, right? So it's like you got oocyte. It's kind of pushed to the side. It's like you have all of these layers of cells. It's kind of pushed to the side, and the blue fluid-filled space, the antrum, is moon-shaped. It's all fluid-filled in here. Okay. And of course, these also have the granulosa cells and the Pika. Let me draw a couple layers of Pika. The connective tissue cell is called Pika. So anyways, red granulosa cells, green Pika in both cases. Anyways, these are larger, and this is the one that will ovulate. And then we'll talk about LH and how it facilitates that when we get to repro. So now we're interested in Pika and granulosa cells. And I did label it. Maybe it's difficult to see when we point it out. This outermost layer, that's the Pika. Okay, they secrete the androstenedione, converted to estrone by the granulosa cells, but you need the influence of FSH to help kick start the aromatase. Okay, so there's oocyte, there's antrum. This is a Graphean follicle. Now the testes, a little bit easier to study. Okay, but first, any questions on follicle development in ovaries? So ovulation will occur right after this is formed, day 14 of the 28-day cycle. So think of the Graphean as the most mature follicle. Okay. to the ovaries, the testes, shown here. If you cut open the testes, you see all these tiny little apartments or compartments. This white fibrous tissue contains these little partitions, the lobules, as they're called. But the reproductive structure are those tubes. If you cut those tubes and look inside of them, the seminiferous tubule is what they're called, and they contain the developing sperm. And we're more concerned with that in the next unit. We're concerned with the endocrine function. The cells that are outside the seminiferous tubules are called the interstitial cells, or the older name I still use, the interstitial cells of Leydig. And those have the endocrine function. And so, if you have a cut tube, okay, with the lumen and the lumen, and what you'll see is that these seminiferous tubules they contain the cells that are basically developing sperm. Testosterone helps for that. Developing spermatocytes. Anyways, be able to identify the cells outside the seminiferous tubule. In the interstitium. Just call them interstitial cells of Leydig. L-E-Y-D-I-G. They secrete testosterone. On this picture that I took, you see a blood vessel there. Of course, testosterone has to get into the bloodstream. Okay. You know, I think that's, I want to start shifting gears here, and I want to start showing you these histology slides on our scope to get you ready for quiz on Thursday. So to help you with that, I did print out, it's on Canvas, but if you didn't have a chance to print it out, the study guide I'm going to go through that you'll be responsible for the quiz on Thursday, I'll leave over here if you want a copy. Go ahead and help yourself. I'll go through this now. We'll have the histology quiz. I usually have quizzes at the start of class, but because this is our first one, and I guess we're still kind of getting to know each other, I'll have it after lecture, and I'll even have a brief review time at the beginning of lab where we can just ask questions, and then we'll take the quiz. Okay? And I will group you, group A, group B. I think I'll just kind of post 2 equal groups of you in A or B, and I'll post it on Canvas. So just look at Canvas for that. And what I do is I get the slides. I already put some out yesterday. I got them over there. We'll see it. You'll see what I see. I'll snap pictures with it because there was a camera attached to that setup. I'll save the pictures and I'll upload them to Canvas later this afternoon. And those are the slides, the ones I post. The ones I take now will be the ones you're quizzed on for Thursday. So you'll know what slides are coming your way. But I'm not going to label the slides for you. Since you've got the quiz slides, that would make the quiz too easy. All right. Let's go.